Welcome back, friends. Let's get started with the first part of secret messages. In this video, we're going to look at what is called as string indexing. Now, let's take a step back and understand what is it that we're trying to do in this activity. Remember, in this activity, we are going to get strings like this. For example, meet me in the lobby at 6 p.m. and we are going to manipulate these strings to create new strings, which means that we are going to have to access the individual elements of this string, individual, let's say, characters that make the string, and put them in different places. The act of accessing these individual characters is called indexing. So using indexing, we can say, for example, we can get hold of, say, in this string Python, we can get hold of Y, H, O, and whichever character we want. Now that's what we mean by indexing, and in this video we're going to look at it a little bit closely. Now, for the purpose of indexing, we can think of a string much like a list. Now, why is that? Remember, list is basically a collection of variables where each variable, each individual element had an index, right? We have seen this in Scratch, where elements were called items and the index was called the item number. Now, from the same logic, we can think of a string as a collection of characters where each character has got an index. Though this is valid, this is useful in this present context, I must also highlight that there are some very significant differences between lists and strings. We'll cover that later, but from this point of view, from right now, from the discussion right now, we can think of string as a list. And now, just like we were doing, in Scratch, we can start addressing each individual element. We can start indexing into the string. The only thing to remember really is that in Python, the indexing starts from 0. And this should really not surprise you because you've seen this before. Everything seems to start from 0, right? So what happens here is that, say we have a string, Python is cool. To index, let's say, this into the string, we'll start from the index 0 and we will use a square bracket, right? So let's say the string is called x. X is Python is cool. If I were to do, for example, x of square bracket 0, I'm going to get a p, right? If I try x of let's say square bracket 4, I'm going to get an O. So it's because it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, right? Now, let's do a little bit of compare and contrast. In fact, this is very similar to what we have seen in Scratch. There's a function called letter 1 of Apple. Basically that gives you, for example, in this case, the first letter, which is A. Very, very similar what we are doing here. We are just calling, say, defining a string called apple and calling it x0. The only thing, like I said, to remember is that indices now start from 0. So let's just see some of this in practice, by actually writing some code, because that's the best way to learn. And then we'll come back to the indexing to look at it in a little bit more detail. So I've created here a ripple. Notice that this is not a turtle. This is just a pure Python ripple that I've created. So let's say I define a string here called, say, x is, say, Python is cool. Now you can really use any string, it doesn't matter. But I'm just going to use this string so that you can relate back to your earlier examples. Now, say I run this, which means that when the program is run, now if I look at if I do it in the console, if I look at x, Python is cool. So going to console makes it a little bit more interactive. Now let's say I can start indexing the string. So I use square brackets, say I say x of 0, and you will see I need to get a p. Now I will get a p, right? Now, in case you're wondering why am I getting those apostrophes, that's just because this is a string. If you do not want to see that, you can say print, say x of 0, and then you will get just a p. So really what's sitting in there is only a p, and we can now go ahead and do that. Let's say I do x of, say, 6. Now I'm going to get an empty, this time I got a space because remember indexing starts on 0. So I'm done 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is indeed a space. Let's try, for example, x of, say, 10, and I get a C, and that's because 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. 10 is a C. Notice how we are able to use square bracket with the index to get those individual elements. I must highlight one thing here, that if I do not use a square bracket, for example, let's say I did print x of, say, the round bracket 10 or the parentheses 10, I'm going to get an error, because then if I do this, it looks to the interpreter that we're calling a function, but really this is a string. We've already defined it, and hence we must use a square bracket. So let's just see one more example before I go back to the let's say the slide again. So let's say I say x of say 5, and if I did that, I'm going to get n, and that's because 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's an n. Now convince yourself of this, get comfortable with this, maybe try different strings, and you will find that this is actually not that hard. This is really like list, like I said. Only thing to remember is a square bracket and the indexing starting at 0. Now it turns out that in Python there is in fact one more way of indexing these strings, which is using negative numbers. Now if this is confusing you at this point of time, you can come back to this later, but for the sake of completion, I'm going to cover that here. We can in fact provide indices also using negative valued numbers, which means -1 onwards. Now it's very interesting how this thing works, right? Basically, negative valued indices start from the end of the string. So what happens here, for example, the same string Python is cool, the last element will be given a number index of -1, right? Which means that I can actually access the last element of this by doing x of -1, -2, -3 as I keep coming back, right? So for example, if I go back to my, so this is -14. Let's say we have seen this before. I did say print of x, say 0. I get a P. If I also did print of x of say -14, I'm going to get a P again. And why is that? Because remember, negative indexing starts from the end. So for example, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6, -7, -8, -9, -10, -11, -12, -13, -14, right? Now, let's take one more example. Let's say I did x of say -4. I'm going to get a C, and that's because it's -1, -2, -3, -4. You can take several examples. You might wonder, why would we ever want to do this? Isn't this so much more complicated? In a way, you are right. In fact, for most time, we are going to do indexing with the positive numbers. But there are situations, for example, let's say the string is very long and you do not know how long it is. And for some reason, you want to get the last element of it, or say maybe last 5 elements of it. Then you can use a negative index. It just makes it simpler because you don't have to know the length of the string. You don't have to count from the beginning. Instead, you can just say -1, say, -3, -2, -1, whatever you want, right? So there are scenarios where you can use this. But like I said, the main thing is that every element can be indexed. From the positive side, if I give positive numbers, it's going to count from the beginning, 0. If I give a negative number, I'm going to count from the end being -1. Before I wrap this up, let me just highlight to you what happens if I give an index which doesn't exist. Let's say I say, x of 23. Now, this will give me an error saying that index out of range, and that's simply because, remember, if I start counting at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Now, this string only has 14 characters, that's why it went from 0 to 13. So if I ask Python to give me the 23rd character by putting in square bracket 23, I get an error. In fact, I can try the same thing. Let's say I did x of say -23. Again, it's going to give me an error because the largest, it has got only 14 characters, which means that the smallest number I could use is -14. Anything less than -14 will give me an error. Anything more than 13 will give me an error, right? And that's what we are seeing here. I hope this has become clear for you. As always, please practice, please take different strings and convince yourself how this is working, both on the positive side and the negative side, particularly on the positive side, right? Negative side is confusing. It's okay. You can come back to this later, but make sure you get comfortable with the positive indexing because that is the backbone of this activity. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.